All right, glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. Hey, it's great to be with y'all on this Tuesday morning. That's where it is in our world. And it's such a blessing today. I've got waiting in the green room. I've I've got Professor Adam DeVille. And you're familiar with his work, I have no doubt. He's a wonderful, prolific blogger where he does a lot of book reviews at Eastern Christian Books. I recommend that highly. Um, it doesn't replace reading the book, but it's a good way to enter into it. And of course, he's a professor of theology and the chair of the Department of Theology and Philosophy at St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He's the author of Everything Hidden Shall Be Revealed, and just a serious Christian who thinks and loves deeply. So without further ado, let's see if I can push the right button and bring us on together. And there, everyone can see you now. Good
Right.
morning. It's great to have you here with us. I appreciate your time. I'm a fanboy. It's going to come out, right? I love your work. I love your witness.
Thanks. No, the writing a blog sometimes feel like you're writing it into the ether, and you never know who's out there and if it's making a mark of any sort. So I really appreciate hearing that it's still useful. It's been 10 years now, and it's still fun to do, and I'm glad it's still useful.
Yeah, I mean, you play with ideas in a way that's just it's beautiful to watch, and when we read it, we're part of that, right? It makes us feel like we do that. Like your reviews, and some are positive, and some are fairly critical, right? Your review most recently of Rod Dreyer's what is it? Live Not by Lies, right?
I haven't reviewed that one.
Oh, you haven't reviewed that. Why
I
did I
did the
think?
Benedict option 3.5 years ago, and I'm
That's what it
taking a
was.
pass on this new one. I don't have the stomach, quite frankly.
Right, that's what it was. So I went down there and wanted to see how his other books have been reviewed. Yeah, right. But just the thing is to offer the clarity, and that's what you're bringing. This is what's going on here. These are ideas that are being played with, and what I love about people who are actually trained in philosophy and deep theology is that you notice things that just aren't on our radar. These deeper dialogues, and you allow us to come in and engage with them. And I'm deeply appreciated for that, because often, many of us, we operate on a fairly superficial level when it comes to ideas. Is this kind? Is it loving? Is it useful? That kind of level. Whereas when you bring the depth of patristic knowledge, you're able to say, well, here's where this idea came from, and this is the kind of fruit that it bears if you're not careful. So again,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
really appreciate that. And you've got a book coming out here next year, is that right?
I've got two coming out, actually. They're both international collections. So the one is I edited the proceedings of a conference at the University of Vienna in 2016 that brought together Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholics to talk about events of the post-war period in Ukraine, and see if we could kind of come to a common narrative of that. And then the other book, and that one will probably be out late next year. The other one that's supposed to be out in March is Married Priests in the Catholic Church, it's called. And that I've looked at the reality of married priests in the Catholic Church, that is, married Eastern Catholic clergy, but also some of the Anglicans who've come into the Catholic Church after 2009. But then I brought in the reviewers. It's coming out with Notre Dame Press, and the reviewers were really helpful. They said, don't just keep this to Catholics, but bring in Orthodox experience as well. So I had I was really glad to take that advice and brought in a number of deacons and priests, all but one from the OCA, to talk about their experience, being married clergy. There's one Greek Orthodox priest in there as well, and so it's I'm looking forward to that. It's a deliberately wide-ranging collection. I've got a section in there sort of talking about what's pastoral life like when dad's celebrating Vespers, or parish council, or meeting with the bishop 6 nights out of 7 or something. Hear from clergy families. But then there's sections in there on canon law, and there's sections in there on the history as well. So there's nothing else like it out there really. I'm looking forward to the reception of that book, because I think it'll open the eyes of a lot of Roman Catholics to realities that they haven't ever really encountered in many cases or considered. So yeah, it was a long time in coming. I've been working on it for eight and a half years. But finally got it together, so I'm glad to see it finally emerge.
Yeah, fantastic. And some people wave that as if it was a magic wand that's going to solve all the problems in the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, yeah, and that was a big part of my decision to put that book together, was to say, look, because I'm an enemy of sort of romanticism whenever it shows its head, and people want to romanticize either celibacy or married priesthood. Part of what the book tries to say and show is that you've got sacrifices on both sides, and you've got to be aware of that. And also, as you just said, for Roman Catholics thinking that this is going to suddenly, result in a stampede of new guys to seminaries, think again, because the churches that have married clergy are not, suffering from an abundance of them, and so try to sort of help people be a little bit more realistic about that tradition.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the themes of my own discernment and work, I'm training as a political scientist again, and I teach at seminary, so I play at theology a bit, is polarization. And I'm thinking about the first book that you mentioned, the second one that Lord willing will come out next year. It's such a good example of that polarization. And I really appreciate your attempt, what you said, can we come up with a common narrative? Because what I see, and as I experienced it I'm a Ukrainian Orthodox clergy, Perkins, right? I don't have a drop of Ukrainian blood in me, so it's a weird place to be where I'm condemned as a clergy, sometimes even claim that I lack grace, because of this, that, and the other. And the narratives that are constructed about the last 100 years, and it's amazing. And no one's hands are clean. I really appreciate the way you do that. You say, look, don't Hagiarize either side in this. We've all got to come to Jesus. We've all got to, and we've got to listen to each other. And the process of discernment requires that, and requires that you accept that a witness different than your own, maybe even opposed to your own, is still valid.
Yes.
That's so hard.
Yeah, it is, but I think that's absolutely a crucial point. And some of my other work in sort of psychoanalytic and psychotherapeutic fields, that's one of the things I've come to grapple with, is that if you're working with a patient clinically, the memory they may have or the story they may tell might not be absolutely factually true down to the details, but they might have remembered it as true, and they might have lived their life that way. And so you've got to kind of accept that and work with it, and a frontal challenge to it, say, well, that's just wrong, it didn't happen that way, is not going to help anybody. And I think that's true for groups as well as individuals, and for churches as well, to listen to each other and to say, okay, we don't have a common understanding of what happened during this time or at this place or this event or this, this synod or whatever it was, but we need to listen to each other and find a way forward. And that's really hard, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and that's a wonderful segue into this article that you wrote, the necessity of seeing self-care as self-gift, right? And the way that I think it's a perfect segue is because it's the rare person who, without working on it, is able to enter into that kind of pastoral care, right? We've got too much damage of our own, and so the reaction, whether it's to correct or to just completely accept or whatever, isn't present. And we've got our own damage, and all of us, human beings, we're called to care for one another, and that includes caring for the self. And you lay out some wonderful points here about you make a good case for its necessity, right? And then you give some reasons why it's difficult for many people, and you give the Roman Catholic, the culture, why it sets people up against that. But if you would just reflect more, and again, I'm sure people are familiar with this, but you do have a background not just in theology, but also in psychology and applied psychology, if you would.
Yeah, and it's the application of psychology in a Christian context that has interested me for pretty much my whole academic life, and seeing what's useful there. And one of the things I latched onto quite early on was the late Pope John Paul II. Was very fond of using this phrase. He talked about the healing of memories, or the purification of memories. And he used that. He started using that almost immediately, right after I think he met the ecumenical patriarch in 79 or 1980, somewhere early on. Basically used it for the next 25 years of his papacy. And I thought, there's a depth there that we haven't begun to grapple with. How do we begin to even acknowledge these memories and then find ways of healing them? Whether it's Catholics and Orthodox looking at the Fourth Crusade, or Russians and Ukrainians looking at the Union of Brest, or more recent events in 1946. There's lots of places where we need that kind of healing, and I don't think we've really started doing that. I think there are some places where that's at least acknowledged, but to actually move towards that healing, I think, is something that we haven't really done yet. So it's been something I've been thinking about and writing about for a while. How can we help Christians grapple with those memories and then find ways of healing? Because I think, and I haven't done as much work with the Western splits after the 16th century, but I've really been focused on Catholic Orthodox relations, and in some ways I'm really convinced that's the last significant piece we need, is to deal with those memories, that we've kind of, I think, really wrestled with the theological issues, but what's still holding us back from full celebration of the Eucharist together? I think a lot of it is memory, and then the identity that we build up based on these memories, and that whole sort of mess of memory, identity, hostility, and suspicion, and so on, that leads to that, that polarization you were talking about, in which we've got our opposing camps, and we're quite happy to stay there. We don't want to move, and I think that's not just a tragedy. I would say it's also a sin, because the Lord clearly wants unity in the church. And so we need to allow ourselves, again, to go through that grieving and acknowledgement of the struggles of the past in order to move towards, some of that healing.
Yeah, and what we've been through in the last few years, I don't know, depending on where you want T0 to be, right, is a demonstration of what happens when we're not about that work. Then the momentum of division just finds new excuse, right, to further divide us. And so, we were making, it felt like progress, because in order for those shared understandings to grow, right, there has to be some kind of trust. And in the case of, for the example, take the hardest case within the Orthodoxy in America, the Roe Corps and the UFC USA, very different understanding of many things, and just a parallel development apart, but then brought together even around the altar, even around the Eucharist. And so trust was beginning to build, and that, just the beginning of conversations. But wow, how quickly that all just disappeared, and then a reversion of back to the trenches and so on. And it's heartbreaking. Whereas if we had been about this work in our seminaries for generations, we would have theologians, we would have clerics who, this was the instinct. The instinct was to listen, to understand, to be charitable in interpretation. But we're just not there, and it's heartbreaking. And so now we have all these other excuses that we've collected, and over the past year we've collected more about spoons and masks and just another excuse to come up with divisions. So and it has to be, we're not going to reform the church tomorrow. Your work, though, God bless it, is bringing to light not just damage, but healing possibilities, and I love that. But we're not going to, tomorrow, we're not going to, fix seminary cultures. We're not going to do any of that. But we can begin with ourselves.
Yes.
So what does that look like? How can I recognize the damage in my own mind, and how can I accept some kind of a healing path?
Yeah, that's a great and a huge question. I think you're right. It's not going to be with large programs of church reform. I think it has to come to each of us asking that question and looking what we can do. I'm thinking here of one of the chapters in the book on married priesthood comes from Father James Dutko, who's a priest with the Carpatho-Rusens. And he tells the story because it's a very personal story in terms of just his immediate family, his father and his grandfather, of being in that generation of Eastern Catholics who were basically chased out of the Catholic Church on the imposition of celibacy and became Orthodox, whether in the OCA or in the Carpatho-Rusens. There was a long-standing hostility there that he narrates in the book between the parishes. He's been in Western New York for quite a while. And there were generations that grew up there of these people who were related by blood, but who went to two different churches and couldn't stand each other. And then slowly in the 90s, some of that started to, as his father was retiring from pastoral ministry, one of his wishes for the kind of retirement party was that everybody would come. And so the people from parishes that had been enemies basically for generations came to that and began that kind of starting to get to know each other again. And then that led to regular cooperation. We go to your prosnick and you come to our picnic, and we do all this kind of stuff and begin to heal those relationships. And I think that's the way it's going to go if we can reach out a little bit, make ourselves vulnerable a little bit. And show people that we don't have an agenda except to do the work of healing. If you can kind of lay down the sort of the defensiveness and the desire to prove yourself right, and just welcome people where they are, and begin there at that level. I think. I spent a lot of the 1990s traveling around the world with the World Council of Churches, and I went to all these big and small ecumenical conferences all over the world. And one of the things when my time there ended, one of the things I realized was that's not the way we're going to find unity. The big international dialogues and all these conferences and so on. If we're not bringing this back to the parish and the personal level, we're not going to find that healing. And so I think it really does behoove us in our individual communities to seek each other out and try to find ways of reconciling. And I don't know that there's a program for that. I think a lot of this is just recognizing each other's humanity again and having coffee or something more substantial, but those kinds of things where a lot of us are inclined to look down on and say, well, that's just so ordinary and basic, but that's where I think it's going to begin for a lot of us. The theology needs to be done and the dialogues need to happen, and sorting out these issues, but if we're not building relationships with each other, the dialogues are not going to bear much fruit.
Yeah, right, because the difference that has been crystallized and reinforced with all these, ad hoc theology and stuff, that becomes the lens through which everything else is seen and interpreted. Whereas, if you have a friendship, then you can analyze that difference through the trust that is generated in that friendship. And, that can sound like a betrayal, right? And I run into this a lot, right? It feels to some people like it's just marketing, right? It's something that when you go to buy a car, they know all of the ways of manipulation, and they play on every single weakness in our psychology so they can get us to buy something that we don't want. How, and that's part of the pushback, right? So it's not just while going across that barrier of communion, right? Whether it's ecumenical patriarch, Moscow patriarch, or Roman and Constantinople. It's also within the camp, right? Building trust between so-called liberal Catholics and so-called traditional Catholics, and between the same and the Orthodox camp, because that's missing.
Yeah.
Even within there,
Yeah.
there may be communion, but there's not eating together.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and that's sad but true. And that work needs to happen in house as well as between houses, if you will, to be able to do that. And I think it's probably better to just be open and say it's going to be really uncomfortable. There are going to be people who will refuse the offer of hospitality, but do it anyway. The older I get, the more I'm attracted to that model, which in Slavic Christianity is so prevalent, of the holy fool. And just go and extend that hand of friendship and forgiveness to somebody who's been your enemy. Whether it's within your church or in another church or another nation state, and do it. And be prepared for that kind of reaction. But
Okay, just tried to reset the thing. Yeah, I'm not sure what that's about, because I can't see you either.
Okay.
But I can hear you, and thank
okay.
God. So, talking about the need to develop trust within the so-called camp, or within the communion as well, rather than just across the communion lines. Yeah, and boy, so in the Ukrainian church, you have a very similar dynamic where you'll have, like in Woonsocket, my first assignment, we had the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of St. Michael's right here, and then across the street there was the Ukrainian Catholic Church of St. Michael's, right?
Yeah.
And a history that had not was difficult, right? Because it involved court cases and all that kind of stuff, and was only just starting to be healed. But that's a tough nut to crack. But if you don't mind, let's talk about this idea of self-care, so that we can be witnesses to this, witnesses to the kind of dialogue that brings healing, the kind of relationship that brings healing, because it does take a kind of a health. We can call it, we use virtue words sometimes, like, it takes humility, it takes courage. Yeah, but all of this comes from a healthy heart. So how do we develop that kind of healthy heart?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, anyway, and maybe for the first piece of developing it, insisted trying to shed some of the guilt that often comes into these discussions, and this kind of sense that if we're looking for ourselves, we're doing something wrong. Back to Pope John again for a second. He had another phrase he popularized that I really liked when he talked about self-gift, and I think that is the model of the Christian life, to give yourself as Christ gave himself. But to be able to do that really well requires that we, be healthy enough to start that process. And so I think it does require attending to our own health, diversely understood. spiritual, physical, psychological, emotional. If we don't do that, then it's going to be much harder for us to give. And so it's not that we attend to these things solely because we want to care for ourselves. That's important. But we attend to these things also so that we can care for others. And so if you want to, if you want to put it in the language of virtue, which Christians are often much more comfortable with, then to be able to achieve that mean, which is what a virtue is by definition, right, between excess and defect, according to Aristotle, to be able to achieve that, then you've got to be working on yourself. You've got to be doing those things and building up those practices that become habitual, that lead to virtue. And so there's no point in pretending you don't need to do that, because if you do pretend, it's going to catch up with you at some point. And it's probably not going to be a good experience when it does catch up with you. And so I think it's something that Christians need to be working on, precisely so that you can make that self-gift.
Yeah, and what are some of the things to watch for that it is catching up with you, both in maybe in daily life, in parish life, in relations? What is it that I can see that, oh yeah, because like in my car, the oil change light comes on. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's time to do this kind of care. What are the sorts of signals that you've been putting this off too long?
Well, here's where I think, those of us who are married might have an advantage, because it's often, spouses, children, family members who can point these things out. One of the chapters in the book on Mary Priest is from Irene Galadza, who's Ukrainian Catholic, married to Father Roman Galadza, a longtime Ukrainian Catholic priest in Toronto, actually, the parish where we were married. And she's the one that can often pick up on things in her husband. She says this in the book, to say, you're not looking after yourself well enough. You need to take a couple of days off. You need to go see your spiritual father. You need to go to get your blood pressure checked out, whatever it is. So don't scorn the voices of people around who can often see things that we can't, or see them better than we do, or see them even before we do. I think that's often, again, and that may take a bit of humility, a bit of modesty, to be open to the views of other people who are saying, I see you are moving in this direction, right? Or I've seen this kind of behavior. I think it's time we looked at that. So look, see what others are seeing. But also, just some of the really basic stuff. Are you getting enough sleep? What's your diet like? Exercise. Look at these things, because they can often contain evidence and give us some clues. Are you drinking too much? These kinds of basic questions that might tell us there's something a kilter here, right? There's something a bit off. So attending to that, that basic kind of physical, spiritual, emotional health allows us to be, better Christians for the life of the world, right? As Father Schmemann would put it, to be able to serve others by having attended to ourselves. And I don't want this to appear like it's a zero-sum game, right? If I'm doing this for myself, I'm taking away from the world. No, if you're doing it for yourself, that's to help you serve others. And I also don't want people to misunderstand this and think, well, I've got to do all this work on myself first, so I'm going to shut everybody out. It's these things can happen, and I think for most of us do happen at the same time. So I'm working on the things I need to work on in my own life while I'm also still serving other people. So it's not that I kind of hide myself away while I do this, and then I'll eventually come back. I mean, maybe in extreme cases you need to do that, but it's working on yourself while you're working with other people.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, and you gave a lot of wisdom there, and I just want to reinforce and then maybe push you a little bit about one of the first points is one of the indicators that it's time to get a little bit more serious about this is when people are telling you, hey, you need to get more serious about this.
Yeah.
And there's a prior thing that has to happen, and that is that you have to have people in your lives that you can trust.
Yes.
And for some personalities, it looks like that's a very difficult thing, because they hear things as criticism, and so, or a threat to authority, or whatever it is. And so you get a response and a self-justification, and it deepens the spiral, right? That's tough. And when I'm kind of the opinion that when someone is in that place, then it may take professional help to get that person to figure out what it is that's causing this poor reaction, because until that problem is fixed, it's going to be hard for that person to grow and to be healthy and to grow in virtue. But so hard when you see that. It's so tough.
Well, and in some ways, I think, especially for those of you in pastoral ministry, there are additional difficulties, because you're so often on the front lines of hearing things, and some of them are just simply not true or unfair or really harsh, and you build up a kind of a defensive mechanism to deal with that. And sometimes maybe that defensive mechanism works a little too rigorously and screens out the good stuff you do need to hear. Or that we all need to hear, because we assume it's one more attack on us, or it's one more, attempt to manipulate us or silence us or something, or, as you say, a challenge to authority. So I think we need to have that, in really good working order to know, okay, what do I need to screen out here? What do I need to listen to? And yeah, absolutely. Both the personal relationships in your life, but also the professional ones if you need them. I think two of the Orthodox priests in the book on Mary priests who reflect on their own experience talk about working with certain psychological ideas, and even psychotherapists for that matter. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more, and to say there's no shame at all, and I've written about this in other places, for Christians seeking out that kind of help. There's nothing in Christianity that guarantees you will not have those kinds of mental health struggles that everybody else has. And don't just assume that, I just got to go to Vespers more, or say another rosary, or, make an especially detailed confession next week, and that's going to solve the problem. That might be part of the problem, but if you're looking after yourself requires, some sustained professional therapy, there's nothing wrong at all with that. And in fact, coming to that insight, coming to that admission is itself, I would say, an example of the virtue of courage.
Right. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I love the fact that St. Vladimir's has a psychologist in residence to work with students.
Yeah.
That's just beautiful, and a very godly man. Fantastic. Sometimes what we want when we're administrating a seminary is we want to bring in that expertise, but kind of on our terms. So what the great question is, what tests can we give to make sure that, we don't send out any wolves among the sheep, right? And, the response is, well, wait a second, stop. I mean, we can talk about diagnostic tests and stuff, but let's talk about, healing people in seminary so that they can be pastors that provide healing. Yeah. And that's a different sort of conversation, a different use of psychology.
Yes, it is, yeah. And I think, if I would borrow a model from academic formation, and it might be something useful to consider in seminaries, and that is, one of the big changes I've seen in psychology since I started in the 90s is now people are being asked really from the get-go to do something very concrete, which is design a self-care plan. And and I really think that's something seminarians should start doing, first semester or first year of seminary. What does it look like for you to be looking after yourself once you get into parish ministry, and be very practical about it? And who's going to hold you accountable to this? I had to go through an exercise like that, and that really was a hugely formative experience for me in saying, okay, it's not enough to just say, well, I'm going to try and take a day off once a month, or some vague thing like that. No, here's what I'm going to do, and list it in very concrete details. And then who's going to help me, keep to this plan? And I think if you get seminarians thinking about that first year, and realizing the importance of that once they get into parish life, you might have a better chance of sustaining them over the long haul, and not having some of the problems that crop up if you're just not prepared to be looking after yourself when the onslaught of demands in a parish kind of opens up on you.
Yeah, that onslaught of demands, right? This is the thing that it feels like it's zero sum because I've only had so much time in a day,
Yeah.
right? And there are more problems, more things that need to be done than can possibly done well to begin with. And then the idea that I would take an hour out of every day to exercise, that I would take, whatever your prayer rule is, enough to sustain a good spiritual life. Those things they begin to feel like, if not selfishness, there's still a way in for guilt, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, where is that guilt coming from? Is it blessed? What is it for?
Yeah, yeah. I've thought a lot about neurotic guilt for a long time. In fact, that was one of the things that took me into psychoanalysis. It's an incredibly pervasive thing in the Christian life. I mean, so much so that some analysts and therapists will say, treating particularly Catholics but other Christians is notoriously difficult because of the guilt. It's one of the really helpful things for me was to look at the whole of Scripture and to realize guilt as a kind of a vague neurotic emotion just simply doesn't exist in the mind of the biblical writers. Guilt, when it shows up in the Christian life, is usually tied to something very concrete, an injustice of some sort. And that's where guilt shows up. If you've really done something wrong, in a very clear, verifiable fashion, especially if you're depriving somebody of, a just wage or, food or something, that's something you got to deal with. But this kind of vague guilt that seems to haunt so much of the Christian life, like I should be doing more, or I shouldn't be doing this, or, taking that hour for myself is horrible. I'm at the point now where it just seems really clear to me that I think we have to say to ourselves, that is not of God. That is not the voice of God speaking. That is something else, whether from my upbringing or, some other part of my life, but that is clearly not the voice of God. And so I need to just kind of, if you want to put it in this language, I need to sort of rebuke that voice and say that is not the voice of, the spirit of truth. It's something else, and that's something else I might need to deal with. But in the meantime, don't let that false voice of guilt, detract me from doing what I need to do to look after myself.
Yeah. So self-care requires a kind of self-love, right? If there's self-loathing, it's gonna find an excuse to latch onto things to justify that self-loathing, and it just becomes this cycle of just self-abuse. It's awful.
Yes.
And what some people may hear us saying is, "Oh, you want to give license," right? Yes, we do, to feel good about yourself in Christ, right? Mm-hmm. To recognize that many of the things that we carry around as guilt and we misdiagnose as sin are things that come from the scarcity of time, that come from the scarcity of ability and so on. And those are things that maybe we can work on improving, but they don't point to some kind of deficiency of the soul.
Yes.
Other things do.
Yes. Yeah. It's maybe helpful here to sort of, say to people, self-care does not mean hoarding an extra 6 cartons of ice cream in a hidden part of your freezer, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about those practices that will allow you to recognize and sustain the fact that God created you, and like all of his creation, it's good. And you need to find ways of accepting that and stop, beating yourself up, berating yourself, loathing yourself, as you say, and accept the goodness that God has implanted in you, that you are in the eyes of God. And so these practices are just simply ways of, allowing that goodness to flourish and grow and increase. They're not practices designed to just give you a kind of a secret, loophole for indulging in, your passions, as the fathers would say.
Right. Yeah. And come to find out, when you live according to love, and you are taking care of yourself, that good things happen.
Yes.
And as Westerners, I go straight to well, why? What is it? What does it do? What does it do to my constitution and so on that allows? Well, yeah, but there's a deeper theological truth. if you live according to love, then you're living according to the will of God, and of course, things follow. Blessings just multiply.
Yep.
And I look back on my ministry, right, and I can pretty well correlate my weight, the amount of miles I put on, running, with my effectiveness in ministry.
Yeah.
Right? So I feel like when I stop running, and I gain weight and all this, that it's because I'm spending more time. I'm leaving the barracks and I'm going out to do battle. But the fact is, no, I'm just less effective.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I think that's an important kind of secret, if you will, that needs to be brought out, is for people to see that by giving yourself to these things, you are, by giving yourself to the good practices, you are making yourself more effective, and by taking the time to build up those good practices, you're not detracting from the actions of love towards the people in your life. These two things, I think, are very closely linked. I look after myself in order to be able to look after others. And so if the guilt is kind of bound up with this suspicion that, well, I'm just being selfish, that needs to be broken, I think, and say, no, I'm doing these things not to be selfish, but precisely to look after myself and look after other people. And yeah, pay attention to those things when you start to see, I'm sluggish, I'm gaining weight, I'm not doing much, mood and affect is really low. Those are often the times when you're not looking after yourself and you're not being that effective with people. And it's I think it's better to be honest about that than to just, again, sort of pretend otherwise.
Yeah, let me give a personal example. So, I was a full-time priest for a while, right? And so I had certain routines for example, for preaching, right? The time that I would spend, I have this program called Logos, right, where I have access to my patristic library and Bible commentary and stuff like that. And, I'd just immerse myself, and then I'd have plenty of time for contemplation and working out ideas and so on. And then, on Sunday, Lord willing, it culminated in the homily. But it was a whole long process. Now, I am a so-called part-time priest, and I'm a full-time PhD student in a Tier 1 research school in a research program, and it's very demanding.
Yeah.
And we have 3 kids living at home, and I've got other things going on, and so that's one of the things I had to watch for. What is my attitude towards that homily on Sunday morning, right? Is there guilt that I am not being a proper priest because I am not preparing the way that a good priest does, right? And come to find out, if I try to spend that amount of time, something's got to give, and what we often allow to give is our own health, right? Well, come to find out, when you do that homily, even though you spent more time on it, it is less effective because it's coming from a sick person. And so I just had to lighten up and say, yeah, you know what? You're going to rely on the preparation you did last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. And, just trust God. And it's not ideal. Ideally, these people would have a full-time priest who prepared the way that, he needs. But my point is, I can't carry around guilt with that.
Yeah. And I think the guilt needs to be challenged. You're absolutely right. And I think also we need to challenge ourselves, you just used a phrase. I think what a priest normally does, or what a priest would do. Um, and I find that's a useful exercise for me to be sort of asking and saying, well, says who? What images are lurking in my mind as to what constitutes, the proper conduct for a priest or a professor, or any number of things. And sometimes it's really helpful to kind of challenge those a little bit and say, is that really what people expect, or is that kind of, again, my sort of guilt-ridden superego stepping in here to try and tell me what to do, and allow ourselves to sort of challenge ourselves a little bit and say, yeah, maybe my expectations of myself might need some examination, because I've just kind of, from wherever it came, taken in this notion, and I'm holding myself to that notion, and maybe that's not always the best thing to do, right? Maybe sometimes that notion of what constitutes, appropriate or professional conduct or whatever, might need some examination.
Yeah, and sometimes other people's expectations are unrealistic as well, and that
Absolutely.
just feeds into it, and you can get all
Yep.
kinds of strange things
Yep.
happening then. Yeah, it's a great point. And go back to one of your early points is we need to have people in our lives that are going to tell us these kind of uncomfortable truths,
Yeah.
right? And for the
Yeah.
person who is dealing with guilt, who is often motivated by guilt, then that is an uncomfortable truth. When you
Yeah.
hear, hey, lower your standards a little bit, right?
Yep. Yep.
It sounds like compromise rather than sounding like life.
Mm-hmm.
Or,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, maybe driven by necessity. People, it's economia. Yeah, I mean, a good priest would do this, but by economia, we're going to allow you. Well, no, maybe it's just this is what you, being a priest, need to do right now, right?
Yes.
It's
Yep. Yep.
stop putting the labels that just feed the neuroticism. Right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. One of the people that's been very important for me is the English pediatrician and psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott. Winnicott had a great phrase he conceived in the early 1950s when he talked about the good enough mother. And he was, in his practice, he was seeing all these mothers who'd been separated from their children during the war, because a lot of British families sent their kids into the countryside out of the way of the cities that were being bombed. And, when they were finally reunited, the mothers had all this guilt. And some of the mothers compensated by trying to be absolute perfectionists. And Winnicott realized pretty early on that that's actually doing damage of a different sort to your kid. To neglect them, I think we can all agree that's not good. But to be super attentive and be a perfectionist who wants to make sure that their every need is always attended to, that does damage in a different way. And so he said, mothers just need to be good enough. And he wasn't saying, just slack off and be mediocre. He was saying you've got to find the balance between, total negligence on the one hand and this kind of hyper-vigilance on the other, that never wants them to be disappointed. And I've long believed that is equally true, not just in parenting, but in priesthood, spiritual relationships like that, as a teacher, as a professor too, to be good enough to find that balance, and to say, what, that's enough. I'm gonna let it go. I'm not gonna be obsessing over I could have done more, but to aim for that kind of median. And that's kind of the classic definition of virtue, right? Is good enough between excess and defect. And I think that's a helpful model in, as I say, pastoral work, teaching, parenting.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, good enough as virtue. That's beautiful. It reframes it. We have, and I see this maybe a little bit through Max Weber, right? This how our culture is set up to have these ideals of success, right?
Yeah.
And to tie in our notions of virtue with it. And
Yep.
I can't tell you, this is my own, mess, but yeah, I'm not going to write that book,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, that's, what, that's okay.
Yep.
That's okay. And yes, so other people are more, quote, successful, right? But would you be successful in their shoes? Would you be healthy? Would you be in Christ, would you have manifested him to the people in your lives along the way?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a change of mind. So it's part of it is getting rid of the neuroticism, getting rid of the guilt,
Yep.
and caring for the self. But so much of it is, St. Paul says, it's no longer I live, it's Christ who lives in me.
Yes.
I don't boast of anything but my infirmities, right? That can sound like an invitation to neuroticism, but it's not, because he was living a life of love. He was living a life of fulfillment, right? But it wasn't him. And to be able to let go of this and stop trying to drive so much, and to turn everything into some kind of math equation for virtue,
Mm-hmm.
is part of the answer. And I tell you what, I can just let go a lot easier when I'm well.
Yeah. 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 And letting go is, again, this is where Christians, I think, maybe have an advantage of other people. I mean, you look at Christ letting go, and here's a man by any standards, ancient or modern, whose life was not a success. I mean, he ends up dead, and let ourselves be reminded of that, and let ourselves, crucify some of those images and those desires we have for, maximum success, and realize that those are, worldly notions in some ways we would do well to steer away from. And again, that's not a call to sort of slough off and do nothing, but it is a way of saying, don't be seduced into thinking, you've got to be this top achiever in whatever field it is you're in, because that's not necessarily what God wants.
Oh yeah, well, I'm going to have the very best self-care plan.
Yeah, right.
You
Yeah,
watch me.
yep,
And then
yep,
we have another thing to be neurotic about.
exactly.
Yeah, one of the things that if we can get this right, if we can get enough of this right, then what we're going through right now, which is just difficult, right? This time of the coronavirus,
Yeah,
we can take the next few months and be ready to do the kind of work that is going to be called for as the church moves out of this time, of whatever it is, through the period of shock and grief, and then to be ready for the opportunity to really minister to a world that is all of a sudden very much more aware of its brokenness and of its deeper needs.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think it's good to be asking those questions now, and planning a bit and seeing what we can do to offer people, and not be surprised when some of those questions and those needs, start showing up. It's I think this is a moment in some ways where people are more open to those questions. And we need to be able to hear those questions and help people find their way towards the answers that God wants them to know, as we, as you say, as we come out of this period.
Yeah, and it's going to take some patience.
Mm-hmm,
Okay,
mm-hmm.
we're
Yep.
One of the things that, because I mean, both of us, we're the smartest people in any room, right? We're going to have answers for everybody and ways of framing things that it's going to be the right way to frame them for them to understand and move on. But no, what it's actually going to take is some time with people, right?
Yeah.
Just telling the story of the past year, the past 2 years, and sharing those stories, right? And seeing people. And then, we'll be together and we can face the challenges of evangelism, which is what we need to get back about. Well, you know what? It has been such a blessing. I'm sorry that we've had the technical hiccups and stuff.
That's all right. That happens.
But I really do appreciate your time, and I so value your witness. I don't know if we said it while we were on air, but I think it was early on where you said, you write these things and you put them out and you don't know, right?
Yep.
No,
Yep.
it's real. Glory to God, work done well has an effect.
Good.
And
Good. Thank you.
We pray for to do this for many, many years to the glory of God.
All right. Yes. Well, thanks. No, it's been lovely to talk and bounce some of the these ideas around, and thanks for the invitation. This has been great.
Yeah, and let me go ahead and get on your calendar for next year, especially when the book about the Ukrainian narratives comes out. I'd really love to. Actually, I'd love to just sit back somewhere and just learn about all these stories. And I'll do it by reading the book as well.
Oh, yeah, no, I'll be happy to talk again. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Until next time, everybody. Godspeed.
Thank you.